I'd like to begin this class by acknowledging the land and the Haudenosaunee, Lenape, Shawnee and Susquehanna peoples, upon whose unceded land we are gathering here at Pennsylvania State University. I recognize the sovereignty of the indigenous peoples to this land, and I offer my tobacco to ask for permission to share this land and to ask for guidance to conduct this class in a good way. So why is it important that we acknowledge the land we're on and its original peoples? To me, there are two reasons. We all live off the land. It provides us with the food we eat, the fiber that makes our clothes, it cleans the water we drink and the air we breathe. Only when we're aware of how the land is taking care of ourselves can we begin to take care of it. At the same time, and this is where we get into the realm of sociology, how we relate to the land is at the core of questions related to power and justice. Rural sociology is a sociology of the land. Who gets to live where? Who has access to land for farming and whose farmland has just been sold to a higher bidding operation? Who enjoys the beautiful scenery and whose water has been poisoned by a new Superfund site? More than any other sociology, rural sociology is directly concerned with the material conditions of our lives. And while we are thinking through these questions, there tends to be a glaring silence about the original injustice in North America, the theft of the land from indigenous peoples. Maybe theft is too nice a word, and armed robbery would be more accurate. The silence goes so deep we don't even know what happened. When you look back to your high school history classes, how many weeks did you dedicate to the history of Native Americans before Columbus got lost in the Caribbean? How many weeks did you talk about George Washington's genocidal missions in the Northeast to drive out the Haudenosaunee Confederacy or the ethnical cleansing commanded by Andrew Jackson? How many weeks did you talk about Christopher Columbus, the Mayflower, and roughly 250 years of US history in comparison to at least 115,000 years of indigenous history in the very same place? Some scholars say that this one-sided view on history is not accidental. We must not be reminded of the violations of our own values like justice, freedom, even private property if you believe in it, if we want to continue reaping the fruits of this land without a heavy conscience. So whose land exactly are we studying in rural sociology? That of indigenous peoples or the land of settlers? And in the case of the latter, how did settlers come to own this land in the first place? The sociologist Buenaventura de Sousa Santos writes that only when there is justice in our thinking can there be social justice. And that is the second reason why it is important to acknowledge the land and its original people. To make up for our one-sided history lessons, I assigned the introduction to Roxanne Dunbar-Otis' landmark book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, which describes US history from an indigenous perspective. Her central argument is this: the United States are born out of colonial conquest and an ideology of white supremacy and manifest destiny. That is the idea that white people were destined to rule the continent from sea to sea. Of course, this is a convenient narrative for settlers who also happen to be hungry for land and in the possession of powerful arms to take it. From the perspective of indigenous people and other people of color, of course, this narrative is deeply offensive and erases their own histories. Dunbar-Otis introduces an important term that is gaining traction in the social sciences: settler-colonialism. Lorenzo Verancino described settler-colonialism as a social order in which a group coming from the outside appropriates a territory from indigenous peoples in order to create a home for themselves. Besides the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Israel are prominent settler-colonial states. Anthropologist Patrick Wolfe famously described settler-colonialism as a structure rather than a historical event. Put differently, settler colonialism is central to the contemporary social organization in North America. So central, indeed, that we don't even think of it. As white people, we are not used to think of ourselves as settlers, a term that doesn't roll off our lips easily. But as Lohman and Barker argue, it is important that white people like myself endorse our identity as settlers because it opens up a way to acknowledge the harm done in the past and consider ways to restore justice. Or as Dunbar-Otis writes on page 7, To say that the United States is a colonialist settler state is not to make an accusation, but rather to face historical reality. I want to give 3 examples of how settler colonialism is effective today. First, the US Census Bureau counted about 3 million people in the United States who identified as Native American and belonging to one of more than 500 federally recognized tribes. Their survival and testimony alone is testament that the last word on indigenous settler relations has not yet been spoken. Although tribes are said to be sovereign nations with their own right to self-government and self-determination, in reality, the political, social and economic life of Native American is almost completely under US rule. For example, tribes cannot determine for themselves who can be a member, but have to follow federal laws that make memberships in a tribe dependent on a blood quantum. Compare that with US citizenship, which can be granted under certain conditions to anyone regardless of their race. The control of tribes over their ancestral land is confined to reservations that have often been established on marginal, unproductive land that makes it difficult to build or maintain any prospering economy. In addition, white supremacy routinely subjects indigenous people to racist violence. Just as black people, indigenous people are much more likely to be stopped and even killed by police than white people. When indigenous people exercise their treaty right to hunt and fish off their reservation, they are often confronted and threatened by white people. And when indigenous people, in particular women and girls, are being killed or disappear, the causes for these crimes often remain unresolved. These and other forms of inequality and violence often leave Native Americans feel like second-class citizens on their own ancestral land. The second example for ongoing settler colonialism that I want to present is related to my own research. In 1909, Canada and the United States signed the Boundary Water Treaty, in which the 2 countries agreed to jointly manage shared bodies of water, like the Great Lakes. Of course, these waters are also used by indigenous nations, but these tribes and First Nations do not have the same status in international water management like the United States and Canada, if they consider it at all. At Rainy Lake, a transboundary lake in Minnesota and northwestern Ontario, hydro dams that have been sanctioned by the US and Canada are destroying much of the area's wild rice, a plant which used to be central to the economy and identity of the local indigenous Ojibwe and Métis people. Think of it as if a foreign power would prevent American farmers from growing wheat and corn and what consequences that would have. And despite talk about nation-to-nation relationships between indigenous and federal governments, the status of tribes in that area in decision-making about water is that of an interest group rather than sovereign nations. The third argument that I want to make to show that settler colonialism is effective today relates to our university. Here at Penn State, we're studying at a land-grant university. That means the federal government granted about 776,000 acres to Penn State to deliver public education and research. Have you ever wondered where the federal government has gotten that land from that is now furthering your education? High Country News asked the same question and published a pungent report that traces the land grants to US universities to land stolen from Native Americans. I assigned you this report, either in written form or as a podcast for this week. The consequences of this is that we students or instructors here at Penn State still benefit from the appropriation of indigenous land at an institution at which indigenous students, administrators and faculty are way underrepresented. Add to that the land grant mission was, and still is, predominantly geared to support the types of economies that have displaced indigenous peoples, such as industrial agriculture, forestry and mining, you begin to see how involved land grant universities are in settler colonialism. Rural sociology, as a discipline both committed to social justice and the land grant mission, has yet to come to terms with this legacy. As we can see, settler colonialism is very much alive, and we need to grapple with it both analytically in describing the society we live in, but also when thinking about justice today. We addressed the question of reconciliation and reparations in the last seminar of our class. But for now, I wanted to give us some time to reflect on the settler-colonial present and past, before we can think about a decolonized future. Before we part for this week, I wanted to quickly comment on the tobacco that I offered earlier. Ojibwe elders and mentors of mine that I met during my research field trip taught me that offering tobacco is a way of acknowledging the spirit of the land on which we work, and a way to connect to the original caretakers of the land. I don't think offering tobacco is nearly enough in order to decolonize our thinking, but from what the elders taught me, without offering tobacco, you miss a very important part. I almost forgot about the question of the week. So what I want you to do this week is try to find out who the original peoples were of the land that you grew up in. What happened to them and where they are living now, what the relationship to the land is today. The website nativelands.ca is a really good resource for you to do that. And that's it for today. I hope you get to enjoy the weekend, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next week. Have a good weekend.